I'm with my colleague, longtime collaborator, and good friend, Dr. John Heil. And it's great to be with you on the Mettle Minds podcast today, where we speak with sports psychologists, elite athletes, and sport medicine providers on their experiences of injury, hope, and resilience. Today, Dr. John Heil and I are going to talk a little bit more about Simone Biles and to use her case as one that's instructive in talking about larger issues surrounding injury and athlete mental health. Great to be with you today, John.
Yeah, great to be with you as well, Les. Glad to continue our collaboration. So, yeah, clearly, Simone Biles' decision to withdraw from the Olympics has shined a light on an abundance of issues in sport, creating a sort of Biles effect, really. And I know our intent here is not an evaluation or judgment of her as a person, but an examination of the issues that her actions have brought to light, important issues for sure. And so we want to look at her actions, its impact on sport. And of course, we want to do it with sensitivity to the everyday reality of sport, but we want it informed by sports science. There's a lot of commentary already out there, and I think we want to be comprehensive. We want it well-rounded. So the number one topic is, of course, athlete mental health, and important topic, but there's a lot more going on beneath that and in conjunction with that. Issues related to injury risk and readiness, athletes' rights and organizational culture, the role of cumulative stress and the more severe critical incidents, the remedy that's found in along the way in traumatic growth, leading maybe to remarkable feats of recovery and performance, kind of stepping into the roots of all this, the enduring ideals of the Greek Olympics. And lastly, just trying to think of this from an advocacy perspective, seizing this moment as an opportunity to help drive change in sport.
Yeah.
So we do regard Simone Biles as probably the greatest gymnastic athlete of all times, and clearly one of the best athletes of the 21st century. We can say that she's an expert on her own sport and her own body. She knows best. That's why she excels and stands out so much. And I think if she says she's not ready to compete, that she's not safe to compete, we just need to accept that at face value. Yeah. She is the expert. She deserves the final say.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, John, that I read on that note is that she, just has this exceptional sense of where her body is in space, what sport medicine practitioners often refer to as proprioception. And so to your point, I definitely agree that, if she's, as she's expressed, feelings of worry and apprehension about not having this sense of what her body is doing and being able to sync her body and mind, that I agree. I think it's really important that people take her at her word, and she really does know best her body and what she's capable of. So I agree with you on that for sure.
Yeah, I think her choice has been really seen as largely without precedent. There's been some reference to tennis player Naomi Osaka, but there is an important difference, and the important difference is the inherent risk in gymnastics. And so I would say a better comparison in this case would be to Alex Honnold, the big wall rock climber whose story is featured in the movie Free Solo. As it turns out, on the first day he was scheduled to climb with everybody set up to record and everything in place, he just said, "Today is not the day. I can't do it today." And so we're good. And he came back another day, completed what's considered to be one of the most extraordinary accomplishments in 21st century sport, but a situation that in failing would have almost certainly led to death. So he chose his time, he chose his moment. He accomplished his objective, and he did it safely. He can live to tell about it. So,
yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And and as you imply, it's not necessarily that he's receiving criticism. On the contrary, he's praised for his accomplishment, as he well should be. But similarly, I think, it takes a lot of courage for Simone Biles to do what she's doing. And as you suggest, gymnastics is certainly a high risk sport. I mean, in training and every day, these athletes face risk every time they perform one of these high risk maneuvers. And I think that shouldn't be underestimated, that, and certainly there's a lot of research to suggest that when athletes do experience acute and high levels of threat perception or stress, that they are much more vulnerable to injury. So yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a setting for this. I think the opportunity for this moment has been coming for a long time, with the rising tide of interest in athlete mental health really coming from all quarters of sport, consensus statements by the International Olympic Committee, by the NCAA. Probably the tipping point is the Weight of Gold video produced by Michael Phelps, featuring a number of Olympic athletes, that where they reveal the stressors that they face, and the way they struggle through those, sometimes at great personal cost. So the Olympics is the spotlight of the world in sport, and this does then create that moment. I think one of the things that helps is Biles is such a sympathetic, charismatic figure. It's a lot easier to hear it from her than it might be from someone else. And I think when it comes from an elite athlete, it always carries a lot more weight, which is, again, the value of the Weight of Gold film. So someone else were to say it would go perhaps unnoticed, but that's certainly not the case here. And I think it's been to everyone's, in the long run, it will be to everyone's advantage to be able to have more of this type of conversation.
Yeah, no, and definitely, I think it helps pave the way for that conversation. And, as you suggest, even, and has been indicated by Biles or others in the media, that, even amongst the very best athletes, that, they're subject to these moments where they experience debilitating fear and worry and apprehension, and that should be legitimized and seen as something that's okay to discuss and to talk about, and should be prioritized as well. So yeah.
Yeah. So I thought it would also be helpful to touch on injury risk and the idea of readiness, which within sports psychology is a pervasive term, one that's receiving a lot of attention. Every time you compete, or every time you get in your car, you assume some degree of risk, but you want the risk and the benefits to balance out. And I think what we saw here was the risk balance with benefit was really way out of skew, and that's what really led her to step aside. Now, my understanding is that in gymnastics they have a term called the twisties, which is a fear of losing your orientation in space. And in particular, it's with somersaulting twisting motions, where it's combination, whereas you're mentioning proprioception is key. And it's really hard to operate on visual cues. So essentially what they're talking about is a fear factor, I think, with the twisty. And I think I'm going to ask you maybe to comment a little bit more from the science perspective. But in short, fear seizes the mind, forces a focus on failure, which then becomes more likely, because you're focusing on the thing you want to avoid instead of the thing that you want to accomplish. We know that positive thinking doesn't fix all things, but we do know that a negative image makes a negative outcome more likely.
Yeah, well, exactly. And, that's been shown in research, where ironically, the more likely you are to think about something you want to avoid, the more likely you are to bring that event about. And certainly there's an abundance of research highlighting the impact of stress and the implications that it may have for attention. So, under stress or high threat situations, such as in an Olympic Games, where there's millions of people watching, where, athletes have obviously spent years training and preparing, and there's pressure to win and perform well, that stress may have debilitating implications for their attention. So, maybe they're thinking about a mistake they made, or, the consequence of failure, or failing to live up to other people's expectations. And when they get distracted, it's not hard to imagine that if you're having those distracted thoughts and you're on a 3-inch balance beam, or you're performing these complex motor movements, that you're more susceptible to getting hurt. But there's also physiological implications to stress, as you well know, John, where the athlete, maybe the stress impacts their physiology. They tighten physically, their timing and coordination is reduced. Their muscle function and movement patterns are inhibited. And all of those things, certainly in a high-risk sport like gymnastics, can increase injury risk. I think Biles acknowledged that explicitly in a number of her quotes. She said that she wants to walk out of there rather than be taken out on a stretcher. And certainly the evidence speaks to that likelihood when the athlete is stressed. So, yeah, I think that's important to acknowledge for sure.
So, I think maybe a next area to delve into would be athletes' rights and organizational culture. And, sport is a culture. Each sport within the world of sport is a culture. There's certain things that are common understandings. There's common language. There's expectations about behavior, how things will go. And we could say, obviously, that she's part of gymnastics culture. And we've seen that gymnastics culture has not done the best it could by a long shot for its athletes. And so she's living her life as an athlete within that particular culture, and all that it entails, all that's good about it and all that's maybe not so good about it. And so that poses the problem. Why would someone maybe go ahead and do something they feel they're not ready to do and risk injury? And I think the answer is, if your fear of letting others down, if your fear of being shamed, if your fear of losing a spot on the team is greater than your fear of being injured, then you might try it. Because injury, as we could say, is a graceful way out. At least I tried. I'm mentally tough.
Yeah.
Didn't succeed, but I gave everything. And if that evolves from a cultural expectation or a cultural norm of shame, then we really have a problem.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely a lot of social science research that's come out over the last 15 or 20 years that highlights that exact point, that athletes don't exist in a vacuum. They are, as you say, part of a sport culture where there are strong norms and values and attitudes that are cultivated. The athletes that make it to the Olympics tend to be the ones that listen, that comply, that work through the pain, that aim for to exceed their capabilities. And while I think it's fine to focus on performance and achievement, it's also been suggested that there may be limits to that, or certainly a downside to that. If athletes unquestionably internalize or uncritically accept and adopt some of these norms about pushing through pain, about being their best, about not letting the teammates down, then they potentially do themselves a disservice, because they put themselves at greater risk for things like injury or chronic and long-term pain. I think, again, as I mentioned at the outset, for Biles is acutely aware of the fact that she may and already has received criticism for her actions, that some people will say, well, she's just not mentally tough. Maybe she's not as good as we thought she was, those kinds of things. So I think it does take a lot of courage to stand up and do what she's doing, particularly at this, event where the eyes of the world are on her. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that plays really right into the idea of athletes' rights. Is it her right to do that? And it seems like it should be, although many would act as if it is not. And I think in some of the reading I've done in terms of reaction commentary, I've seen it framed as a woman's issue in sport, but to me, really, it's an athlete issue. I think it's about women and men. I think it's about elite athletes and other athletes, and I think it's about children and adults as well. I think this is much more than about women. There's a much bigger picture here, and I think it affects people in sport from top to bottom.
Yeah, yeah. I would concur wholeheartedly. I mean, I think, athletes, again, the ones that tend to make the team are, the generally athletes who comply. And of course, on some level, it doesn't work if the athlete is always questioning the coach's decision or judgment. But on the other hand, if athletes don't necessarily stand up when they feel that maybe they shouldn't compete or that they're putting themselves in harm's way, then that's problematic. And there are countless instances of deference to authority or obedience to authority where athletes maybe are complying and listening to someone in a position of power. And I think it's important, and these examples or moments like what Biles is doing in the Olympics maybe serve as a good template or instances where, as you said, high profile athletes can serve as role models for others to follow. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk some about cumulative stress and then also about critical incidents, referring to catastrophic and fatal events in sport. Stress builds over time, as we know, and we know that there's a well-documented but perplexing relationship between general everyday stressors and injury risk. We have research that shows that does happen. And we know that over the course of a career, stress can accumulate and build over time. Some of our research with military and people in the public safety field shows that cumulative stress sometimes can result in traumatic stress disorders and just kind of, which then suddenly appear to show themselves out of nowhere, but really have been slowly building to a point where there comes a tipping point. And we could speculate that perhaps that's what happened. It's the life in that culture, the many misfortunes that the gymnasts have experienced over this generation of women's gymnasts in particular, just kind of building and kind of culminating in that moment where so much attention is placed upon her. I don't think anyone received more attention coming to the Olympics than her. And, the tough thing about the Olympics is the gymnasts live in obscurity year after year, and then they're front and center. By comparison, I think the professional athletes are used to more media attention and intrusion, are better adapted to that, have more organizational mechanisms in place to cope with that and to manage that. So it becomes, in a way, easier for them. Also, the refrain after the lost championship is, let's come back next year. And it's 4 years with the Olympics, or in this case, even 5. So
yeah. Well, and for sure, as in, I guess, many elite or high performance cultures, there's ongoing and cumulative stressors that athletes experience and endure, whether it's the volume of training or, injury itself can be a significant stressor and leave the athlete feeling vulnerable on a variety of accounts. Maybe they don't receive adequate rest. Certainly, as you allude to, in the case of, I guess, gymnastics, there's been a number of issues in recent years and cases of abuse and that have been documented. All of these things can undoubtedly take a toll, and maybe there does come a point where maybe it becomes too much. And again, I don't want to speculate too much specifically on Simone Biles, I guess, but it's not implausible to suggest that the cumulative stressors that she has been experiencing, and maybe I don't know whether there are organizational failures in place in terms of like preparing these athletes for the spotlight. As you say, they're not necessarily not all of them are front and center. And so, there may come a point where it just does become the straw that breaks the camel's back, and maybe that's this moment for her. But yeah, I think again, it's important to recognize that over time, these stressors can accumulate and have a significant impact on the athlete's physical and mental well-being for sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning a little bit about when that worst thing happens. So we do know that catastrophic and fatal injury happen in sport, fortunately infrequently, but with a predictable degree of regularity. And were it not for proper equipment, safeguards, cautions, that would be even more frequent, more likely to be the case. And having dealt with some sport fatalities in particular, the impact is really devastating, and its reach is very broad. It affects the athletes in their immediate circle, their teammates. It affects other athletes in the sport. It affects families. It affects the culture. And there's, in the aftermath of events like this, there's often this great effort to do something to prevent the next crises. And it essentially operates as one of the Freudian defense mechanisms. It's called undoing. It says that people try to do so much after the fact that it would almost undo what happened, which of course is not possible, but nonetheless, that seems to be a driven behavior. And what everybody wants to do is to avoid the situation. So, who knows, we may have avoided that situation, which is the best solution of all.
Yeah, just as you're talking, I was thinking about moments, or I believe it was at the Vancouver Olympics with the bobsledder who went off the ramp in training, and and then subsequent, that was before the actual event was underway, and then athletes still had to compete, and I can only imagine the difficulty in how an athlete has to try and compartmentalize that event to then go out and compete themselves. So yeah, certainly those incidents, as you say, while somewhat infrequent, clearly can have a significant impact on a whole range of individuals and stakeholders for sure.
Yeah, so I think this whole ball of wax of the inherent pressures of sport, the pros and cons of organizational culture, the history of injury, the present risk, and so on. We can work through those. That's part of what we as sports psychologists work on, and so we can help athletes perform better and be healthier by helping them deal with the traumas that have accumulated over time, to help them be more clear and confident in their abilities, to help them be more secure in their mental health and well-being, and perhaps make better decisions and maybe even be better athletes. And I know, Les, you've done a lot of work on the idea of remarkable feats of accomplishment, the idea of post-traumatic growth and so forth. And I was wondering if you might be able to say something about that.
Yeah, sure. So, there's often that saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I guess what we found with in a number of studies is that's not necessarily the case by any means. And certainly there's ample evidence, as you alluded to earlier, John, that athletes or people experiencing some form of trauma, whether it's in the athletic realm or in some other domain, that all too often people can be debilitated, can experience things like post-traumatic stress or severe anxiety, all of which may be normal reactions to those kinds of experiences. But there's also evidence to show that even some of the most challenging experiences may also elicit some kind of benefit. And sometimes that may require time and distance from the experience. But in a number of studies, one of my former doctoral students, Chris Hammer, was a Paralympian himself. And in several studies, we looked at some of these processes through which individuals were able to experience what's referred to as post-traumatic growth. So the idea that rather than being debilitated, that at some point people experience change or personal growth, as the name suggests, or that they're different in some way because of the experience that they've had. And a number of things, I guess, have come out from some of those studies. So for one, individuals who deliberately reflect on the meaning of that experience and, how they can use that event or channel it in a way so that, they can move forward. So, this deliberate reflection seems to be important. But also, you mentioned earlier kind of the organizational culture, and, people, it comes as no surprise that people also need support to get through difficult life events. And, what we found is that the greater the extent to which individuals experience support for their need to be competent or to experience a sense of proficiency or competence in what they're doing, which is often jeopardized in the aftermath of a debilitating event. Maybe the person can't walk anymore. They experience a lot of incompetence. So the extent to which support providers foster, reinforce that idea that they're competent, that they have some sense of autonomy or control over their world and their life, which is often kind of upended, the sense that they no longer control their world or what happens to them, and this need to feel connected or related to others. And, we found that when those needs are supported or fostered, that it seems to increase the likelihood of growth. So again, I guess coming back to my initial point, it's not that people automatically or inevitably grow as a consequence of trauma, but I guess it's more so a case of whether they as individuals are able to engage in certain behaviors and what's happening in their support environment.
Mhm. Okay, let's take another step and let's try to look where does this come from? What is the origin of these expectations? And why do they seem so strong, so entrenched? And there's a concept in sociology called cultural schema, deeply embedded beliefs about culture that define culture. And this can be a pervasive human culture, it can be sport culture, that are very implicit beliefs and expectations that kind of lie underneath the surface. And we respond to these without really clearly knowing that we are clearly understanding why. And I think in the Olympics, we can look back to the Greek tradition and the heroic ideal and the ideal of personal sacrifice. And the best example I can think of is the marathon race. The marathon celebrates the run of Pheidippides, according to legend, from the plains of Marathon, where the Athenian forces defeated the Persians, to Athens to declare victory, collapses and dies. And the length of the marathon, the odd length of the marathon, 26 miles, 385 yards, is supposedly the true distance from the battlefield to the city. And so we continue millennia later to value that and to honor that. And it seems that is an example of a deeply embedded cultural belief that really influences behavior, and that I think sometimes shows itself in subtle ways that are unintended. And I know as we were preparing for our talk today, you made mention of a commentator that said, oh, it's not a physical injury, it's just a mental condition. So
right. Yeah. Yeah, I think implicit in that comment by the commentator, whether it was intentional or unintentional, is the fact that the mental aspects of training, of sport, have traditionally been downplayed, or in the case of athletes experiencing some kind of issue, that it's quote unquote just mental and therefore less significant or salient or worthwhile to consider versus a physical issue. And as you mentioned at the start of our conversation, John, I think more and more people like Michael Phelps and these high profile athletes, when they come out and they say, that they've had these struggles, that they are fallible, that, they have insecurities, vulnerabilities, that, that maybe gives more credence to these issues, and allows other athletes, or paves the way for them to come out and to create more of a culture where it is legitimate, where it's acceptable to come out and say these things, to have these experiences, and not to be marginalized or delegitimized as a consequence. I guess I would also, you mentioned the culture. I guess there's a long history in Western culture where these sport norms come from. They don't just, magically appear, but there's long roots of striving for excellence and those kinds of things. And it's not that those things are inherently negative, but again, I think there should be some critical reflection of them and suggestion, that there are times when athletes should reserve the right and need to stand up for their own well-being, or that organizations have an accountability to do so.
Les, I know you made a pretty strong run towards an Olympic berth yourself, only to be derailed by your own injury experiences. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about what was the culture of your sport, and what did you observe as you tried to work through those injuries and continue to compete?
Yeah, so I competed in amateur wrestling, which is certainly a very physical and technical, tactical sport. And, in my case, I unfortunately endured numerous injuries by the time I got to university. And, many of the athletes, I guess, that I've alluded to in our conversation, certainly when I was younger, had the mindset that it was only sort of the softer athletes, quote unquote, that got hurt, or, that was something that happened to other people, but not necessarily to me. And then, unfortunately, by the time I got to university, in my first year, tore my anterior cruciate ligament. And then over the course of, I guess, the next 6 years of my wrestling, tore the same ligament 2 more times. So I had 3 ACL reconstructions, and I dislocated my shoulder and had that operated on, and had a dislocated elbow. And, so I was often kind of spending more time in the athletic training room than I was competing. And all too often, unfortunately, just trying to rush back to get ready for a national meet or competition. And, in my case, I'm sure there were probably asymmetries and strength imbalances and physical reasons why I shouldn't have been out there competing. But I also know from a psychological standpoint that I often felt like I wasn't as confident as I probably needed to be, and was really tense. I remember competing in the Olympic trials in 1999, and kind of the week before, it wasn't an injury, but I had gotten sick, and I remember it sort of impacted my training, and then in my first match, I was so tense and so tight that I was almost having this out of body experience where I was like looking in on myself competing, and that's not what you want as a high level athlete. You want to just be absorbed and immersed in what you're doing, so that everything is automatic. And so certainly my own experiences, led to my academic interest in better understanding this idea of psychological readiness, and what does it mean or look like for athletes to be mentally prepared, and what, if any, implications might it have. And we've been working over the past few months on a review of some of that research, and the consistent finding, there's probably 20, I would say 3 or 4 studies now that are showing that psychological readiness really is important in terms of things like the likelihood that an athlete does return to their sport, their risk of getting re-injured, whether there's also evidence now linking some of this idea of psychological readiness to physical or functional abilities. So like the athlete's ability to engage in things like hop tests or functional movements. So, I think that's exciting because it really sort of shows that there is this mind-body connection, and that what the athlete is perceiving and whether they feel confident, whether they feel like they have, when they make these risk assessments, if they're having sort of negative emotions or fears of re-injury, that is having an actual impact on whether they return and the quality of those kinds of outcomes once they do return. So, the evidence is showing more and more that there is this mind-body connection that's important, and that we need to pay attention to.
And so I think all this opens the door to change, and that raises the question for us as professionals, for people who have leadership roles in sports, and for athletes themselves. What can we do to make things better, to make things safer? Because I think what we're coming to is an understanding that the better people take care of themselves, not only the healthier they are, but the better they perform. And so this focus on well-being and health, it does not shortcut excellence, but actually feeds into excellence. And so I think we have this moment where there's this opportunity to step forward, and I hope this moment can be sustained, and that some true change can come.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, John. Is ironically, sometimes that mindset of pushing through the pain and feeling that putting your body at risk is what it takes to be successful is actually quite counterproductive and may increase the risk of injury. And obviously, if the athlete is sidelined or they incur a serious or even unfortunately a traumatic injury, they're not going to be able to compete very well. And so shifting the paradigm towards more of a healthy mind-body perspective to account for rest and recovery, to make sure that not just the physical component of training, but athletes' mental health and well-being is addressed, can ultimately probably help them produce better performances, but also just to, go on and be happy, healthy, and fulfilled outside the sport realm too. So, yeah, that's, I think, such an important point.
Les, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I feel like I've run out the thoughts that I have. I don't know, is there anything you would add to our conversation at this point?
No, I think, talked, I think, about some great and important points, and certainly some timely issues. And yeah, I always enjoy our conversations and opportunities to speak, John. So it's, yeah, great to be with you, and thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Okay, great to see you.